Now, if I'm right about this, Kant conditions the semantic account of content on the pragmatic account of force. And the way that his story about what's endorsed is shaped by his normative story about what endorsing is a kind of methodological pragmatism. In this sense, his most basic pragmatism consists not in the explanatory privileging of practical discursive activity over theoretical discursive activity, though there's a sense in which Kant did that too, and his successors learned that from him, but rather his explanatory privileging of force over content within both the theoretical and the practical domains. And I think this is a sort of pragmatism that has not typically been recognized in Kant. Kant's idea is that his normative characterization of mental activity, understanding judging and acting as endorsing, taking responsibility for, committing oneself to some content, his idea that that's the place to start in understanding and explaining the nature of the representational object presenting judgeable contents of those judgings. That's his pragmatic turn. And it's this order of explanation that's responsible for the most general features of Kant's account of the form of judgment. The subjective form of judgment, the I think that can accompany all our judgings, and so, he says in its pure formality, is the emptiest of all representations. Well, thought of in terms of the normative pragmatics of judgment, it's the mark of who is responsible for the judgment. The transcendental unity of apperception is transcendental because the sorting of endorsements into co-responsibility classes is a basic condition of the normative significance of commitments. Committing myself to the animal being a fox, or to driving you to the airport tomorrow morning, normatively preclude me from committing myself to its being a rabbit, or to my sleeping in tomorrow. But they don't in the same way constrain the commitments that others might undertake. The objective form of judgment, the object equals X, to which judgments always, by their very form as judgments, he says, make implicit reference. Thought of in terms of the normative pragmatics of judgments, it's the mark of what one has made oneself responsible to by making a judgment. It expresses the objectivity of judgments in the sense of their having intentional objects, what they purport to represent. And the important point here is that the understanding of the intentional directedness of judgments, the fact that they're about something, is through and through a normative one. What the judgment is about is the object that determines the correctness of the commitment one has undertaken by endorsing it. In endorsing a judgment, one has made oneself liable to distinctive kinds of normative assessment. And what one is thinking or talking about is what plays a special role, what exercises a special sort of authority in such assessments. Representing something, talking about or thinking of it, is acknowledging its semantic authority over the correctness of the commitments one is making in judging. So representational purport, too, is a normative phenomenon, and representational content is to be understood in terms of it. Again, backing up a little, intentionality, semantic contentfulness, comes in two flavors, what we could call of intentionality and that intentionality. The first, or representational dimension, is semantic directedness at objects, what one is thinking of or talking about. The second, or expressive dimension, concerns the content of thought and talk, what one is thinking or saying about what one is thinking or talking about. So one can think of or about foxes, that they are nocturnal omnivores. What falls within the scope of the of in such a specification is typically a term, while what follows the that in such phrases as I think or John thinks that foxes are nocturnal omnivores is a declarative sentence. The pre-Kantian early modern philosophical tradition took it for granted that one ought first to offer an independent account of representational of intentionality, of what it is to represent something, and only then, on that basis, to explain expressive or that intentionality, what it is to judge or claim that things are thus and so. And it's part and parcel of Kant's semantic revolution to reverse also that order of explanation. And that is to say that just as he needed a new and different idea about what one is doing in judging on the pragmatic side of force, which parenthetically gives him a way of talking about probabilistic judgments, normative judgments, modal judgments, in terms of the commitments that they involve, things the tradition had a hard time. Just as he needed a new and different idea about what one is doing in judging on the pragmatic side of force, so he needs a new and different idea about what that force attaches to or is invested in on the semantic side of content. His thought that judging is taking responsibility, committing oneself, requires a corresponding characterization of what one thereby becomes responsible for, commits oneself to. The contents of judgments, we said, are articulated by concepts. The conceptual faculty, the understanding, is the faculty of judgment. Concepts articulate the concepts of judgments by determining what one would make oneself responsible for, what one would be committing oneself to, were one to endorse those contents. I think at this point Kant wheels in a Leibnizian idea. Concepts are in the first instance rules that determine or express what's a reason for what. The concepts being applied determine what follows from a given claimable, and hence what else one would have committed oneself to or made oneself responsible for by endorsing it. And they determine what counts as rational evidence for or justification of a claimable, hence what would count as a reason for endorsing it. An essential element of what one is responsible for in endorsing a claim or a practical maxim is having reasons for doing so. That's part of the responsibility that goes with investing one's authority in the claim or maxim. Again, parenthetically, one important path from Kant to Hegel is thinking about the nature of the reciprocal presupposition of authority and responsibility that Hegel saw in Kant, but didn't see a theory of why each kind of authority came with a correlative responsibility. Hegel built deep into his metaphysics a reciprocal correlative relation between authority and responsibility. Norms have to have a content, and the concepts that articulate those contents are rules specifying, in the first instance, what's a reason for what. We'll see later that to complete that semantic story, he's got to have a root from an account of what's a reason for what, an account of that intentionality, to an account of what we've made ourselves responsible to by undertaking that responsibility. That is, an account of or representational intentionality. And I'll say something later on about how he does that. As normative creatures, then, we're rational creatures. Not in the sense that we always or even generally do what we ought or have good reason to do. That doesn't matter to Kant. We're rational creatures in the sense that whether we do or not, we're always liable to normative assessment concerning our reasons for doing what we do or thinking as we do. However sensitive we are in fact on any particular occasion or even in general to the normative force of the better reason, that peculiar force, at once compulsory but not always compelling, that so fascinated and puzzled the ancient Greek philosophers. However sensitive we actually are to the force of the better reason, we are the kind of creatures we are, knowers and agents, creatures whose world is structured by the commitments we undertake, only because we're always liable to normative assessment of our reasons. Discursive creatures are those bound by conceptual, that is to say, inferentially articulated norms. It's at this level that Kant applies the lessons he learned from his rationalist predecessors. Against the background of this set of ideas about normativity and rationality, which is to say, his new and in many ways unprecedented ways of understanding pragmatic force, what you're doing in judging, and semantic content, what that force is invested in, and their relations to one another, what I called the methodological pragmatism that seeks to read off an account of semantic content from an account of pragmatic force. It's against the background of that constellation of ideas that Kant introduces a radically novel conception of freedom. This may seem like a complete change of topic from the semantics and pragmatics I've been talking about, but it isn't for him. Before Kant, freedom had traditionally been understood in negative terms, as freedom from some kind of constraint. He revolutionized our thought by introducing a special idea of positive freedom, the freedom to do something. Positive freedom, in this sense, is generic